Good morning and welcome to the BBBA webinar on the topic Working from a Distance and at a Distance, the new Office 2020 legal, organizational and facility management aspects. I would like to thank our participants today. We have over 200 registered participants. Half of them have signed in already, so we will give you a few more minutes to sign in. And you see on your screen a short poll with 2 questions. Please take a few seconds to respond. And I'm sure you will be interested to hear the comments from our panelists on the results from the poll later. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the chairman of the British Bulgarian Business Association, Gary Levisley, for a short welcome note. Gary?
Yeah, thanks, Desi. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you hear me, Desi?
Perfect. Okay,
great. Well, this is a very exciting webinar from our perspective. British Bulgarian Business Association, of which I'm the chairman, has been going through a very successful and sustained period over the last 3 to 4 years. We're now up to 240 members, and quite surprisingly, even during this crisis, we've been adding new members at about an average of 5 to 6 a month for the last 3 months, which is an interesting statistic in itself. And many of the new members have actually been attracted by the increased webinar activity that we've been leading. So, you know, out of every out of every difficult situation, you know, it's true that there is opportunities. This is probably the largest webinar that we've held, and I have to thank our partners and panelists from DGKV and Forton have been a big part of that because they also have a big network. DGKV is probably or I should probably say one of the premier law firms in Bulgaria. In my commercial life, I've used them many, many times. Very distinguished, very comprehensive, and particularly in the real estate field. Forton is also probably one of the leading, if not the leading, commercial real estate advisories in Bulgaria. It's part of the AG Capital Group, and is also a partner of Cushman & Wakefield, which is a global UK-based commercial real estate firm. I don't want to take up all of their time. I know you don't really want to be listening to me, but just finally, this webinar is open to pretty much anybody who registered, BBBA members and non-members. And for those of you who are non-members, if you find this event useful, we'd love to talk to you about you becoming a full-time member, but there's no obligation. It is a free and open event. The subject today is obviously more about the recovery post-crisis. I think most people now, particularly in Europe, would say we're over the peak of the crisis. Most of the talk now is how to countries out of the crisis in a safe way while getting the economies moving again. And major companies and small companies as well, so including most of you on this call today, are looking at how to recover in a safe and sustainable way. And hopefully our panelists and guests will be able to give you the benefit of their experience on how to do this. So thank you all for joining. With that, I'll hand back to Desi, who will facilitate the call with our panelists.
Thank you very much, Gary, for your warm welcome to our panelists and to our guests. Now I would like to also to acknowledge the annual sponsors of BBBA. If we could move to the next slide. Thank you. We have Deloitte, Athlon, Cleves, Landmark, Bulgarian Insurance, and Novotel as our annual sponsors, supporting us both with our online and offline activities. Before we move to the very interesting topic, I would like to walk you through the house rules for today. So we have no glitches during the communication. So the chat for all attendees will be disabled. We have 130 people logged in so far and still counting. So we cannot afford to manage a chat. If you have a question, please use the Q&A section of on the Zoom screen, and note that we will be taking care of the questions in the Q&A session towards the end. If there are too many questions and we are running out of time, our speakers have kindly agreed to respond to your questions after the webinar. The webinar will be recorded, so don't worry too much about taking too many notes. You will be able to share it and also to refer to it at a later stage. And now our speakers and our participants. As Gary kindly introduced the two companies that are devoting their time today to this webinar, we would very much like to thank you to Jinkov, Guginski, Kichukov and Velichkov, who are also our legal partner, and to Cushman Wakefield Forton, who have been very supportive of our organization as well. And I would also like to acknowledge Investor.BG, who are our media partner today. I'm very sure that because of our partnership, we managed to reach out to quite a broad audience today. And now I'm sure you will be interested to see the results from the poll. I'm also curious. Okay, so you see that 2/3 of the people who joined today are not BBBA members and 34% are our members. Warm welcome to both groups. As Gary said, if those of you who are not members are interested to learn more about the British Bulgarian Business Association, we will be happy to have a conversation after the webinar. And back to the topic. Where are you joining the webinar from? Wow, 2/3 of the people are still working from home. I'm also joining from home today. I'm sure our panelists will have some very interesting comments on these questions later. So now let's go to the panelists to see who will be commenting for us today. Okay, so we have a renowned group of 5 panelists, 2 from Cushman and Wakefield and 3 from Jinkov, Guginski, Kichukov and Velichkov. I would like to welcome Stanimira Pashova, partner and head of office space at Forton, Petko Luzanov, who is head of project management at Forton, as well as Kaluyan Krumov, who is counsel at DGKV, Lena Borislavova, associate at DGKV, and Victoria Marincheva, also associate at DGKV. Thank you so much for dedicating so much of your time for preparing today's webinar. And without further ado, let's move to the topic. And when we discussed with our panelists, we decided to spread the topic in 3 different subsections. It's a very broad topic. COVID-19 has been very challenging for us emotionally, economically, professionally, and it has affected everyone in one way or another. And now that more and more businesses are preparing to move back to the new normal, it is a great responsibility for both the employers and the employees to protect themselves and each other and help prevent further spread of the disease. The first topic we will be discussing will be, will COVID-19 be the catalyst for rethinking the way we work from the office? I would like to start the conversation with Stanimira from Forton. Stani, do you see any tendencies of what businesses look for when selecting new offices or thinking of reorganizing their current premises? Or is it too early to say?
Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Desi. So for sure, we can confirm that it is a little bit too early to say or to make conclusions that are relevant for a long-term situation on the office market. That's why I would like to start with something that is clear at the moment and is already confirmed, that the supply on the market will move forward as it was planned before the COVID crisis. As you can see on the market, there are almost 400,000 square meters under construction in Sofia. And based on our discussions with the investors, all of them do intend to finish their projects. Once again, to mention that these are projects which are under construction, and in most cases they are with secured financing, some of them already with pre-leases. You can see that the main supply on the office market in the coming years will be concentrated in 4 major areas. And the vacancy rate, as we have reported before crisis, will be on average around 10%. As we will discuss a little bit later, there is a slight increase of the office vacancy rate thanks or as a result from COVID impact. However, this is a short-term impact and it reflects only the existing options for termination or for giving back the space to the landlords under the current lease agreements. This is really an immediate effect, but what is important, and we'll discuss later on, is actually what will the companies undertake and how will they reorganize their offices and the vision towards the office space in the coming 2 to 3 years. This is as an introduction from us, and we'll go further with expected tendencies in our next points and topics.
Thank you, Stanimira. Now I would like to turn the discussion towards the legal perspective. Kaluyan, how is the landlord-occupier relationship changing?
Thank you, Desi. Hello, everyone. I hope you hear me well. After the interesting information shared by Stanimira and the beautiful slide of Sofia, I think from legal point of view, the tendencies which appear to shape is that definitely landlords and tenants will start to look with different eyes on some standard provisions which we have used to see in contracts, because the reality is that the lease agreements are favorable to the landlords. Although some lease agreements are heavily negotiated, still the majority of the situation is that it is focused mostly on the landlord position. And if I can draw a parallel, although this crisis which is shaping as a result of COVID-19 is seen as unprecedented, from the perspective of negotiations of lease agreements, I think we can see a parallel of what has happened after the financial crisis, when the tenants and landlords looked for much more flexibility provided to tenants on certain key aspects, such as flexibility on the lease term, possibilities to increase and decrease the lease space during the lease agreement, also the scope of the sublease and others. But right now, with the impact of COVID-19 on business operations, there are certain new issues which our colleagues will mention later on, certain new issues which require both the landlords and the tenants to look closely and to assess their lease agreements with a particular focus on certain provisions which I'm about to mention. And then with this assessment, then inevitably they will have to coordinate how to reshape their lease relationship. So I think that the main clauses which we as tenants and landlords will have to assess carefully and which will be impacted by this situation are, for example, one is the obligation of the landlord to ensure the normal use and the undisturbed use of the lease premises by the tenants, because in many lease agreements, for example, there are requirements that tenants will have 24/7 access to the lease premises, and with requirements for certain restrictions as a result of the health and safety measures. It is interesting to see whether some tenant might be willing to use this as an opportunity to claim a breach of the landlord, or at least to bring this up in the course of negotiations. Other clauses to focus on is the scope, as I mentioned, on the sub-clauses of sublease possibilities, whether the tenants will be able to sublease part of the premises to third parties, not only to affiliates, what consents will be required from the landlords. Similar to this is the requirements, the possibilities for alterations and changes within the premises, whether and to what extent the landlord will have to intervene or at least provide a consent for the tenant to make changes within the premises in order to address the needs of its employees. So there are various clauses that the parties have to look carefully when they start to coordinate how to proceed further and to address the needs of the tenants and the investments which have to be made in the buildings to provide a new environment for the operations of the businesses. With that said, on the basis of the terms of the lease agreements, the business prospects of tenants, and also the debt service of the landlords, it will very much depend what lease agreements will be worked out and what will be breached, because inevitably the situation is that in some cases, the parties will not be able to reach an agreement because in the end of the day, the business of the landlord is to receive the rent. And in some cases, the lease agreements will have to be terminated one way or another. So this is the way we see the situation currently. Our experience is that we're looking at renegotiation of lease agreements, and actually right before this webinar I had a call with client and its counterparty, which was very interesting, that it is not only the rent concessions which the tenants are looking for, although this is very common right now, but the parties are looking at reshaping the lease relationship in a way that the new premises or the redesigned premises can accommodate the needs of the tenants. It was very interesting that actually the tenant wanted to have showers in its lease premises. So it is very interesting to see how things will develop. The bottom line for me is that we will be looking for much more flexibility in the new lease agreements. So back to you, Daisy.
Thank you very much, Kalyan. It seems that you will be very, very busy in the next months. I just realized that I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Desislava Miteva and I'm the Executive Director of the British Bulgarian Business Association, and it is my pleasure to be the facilitator of today's webinar. Now back to regulations. It has been very difficult for me to keep up with all the announcements about new regulations coming up on a daily basis. Vicky, has the government put in place new temporary health and safety requirements for the office workplace?
Indeed, Desi, since the beginning of March, we have seen plenty of measures issued by various institutions, ministers, and governmental bodies. But now I would really like to focus on what remains applicable and in force. Of course, this is the last order of the Minister of Health, which introduces another new set of temporary measures. This ordinance, however, would only be valid until the 14th of June. So this reminds me that it is important to know that the entire legislation which regulates health and safety, the general provisions of it, remain in force and they must be complied with. And another thing to be noted, especially by employers, is that the Labor Inspectorate has been quite active during these last months by publishing updates and guidelines on their website. The last one being issued mid-May and reminding the employers of their duty to update the health risk assessment and, of course, conduct instructions. So if we need to sum up what is currently required by the employers in terms of temporary measures, there are two major groups. The temporary measures which must be applied by all employers, but also there are some additional temporary measures which need to be considered by employers who are engaged in particular activities, for example, working with clients directly or running or owning public facilities or commercial sites. Anyway, whatever the measures are, we need to say that to ensure legal compliance, but most of all efficiency, the measures, temporary or permanent, they must be first regularly updated. As the situation evolves, so must measures evolve. And second of all, they must be suitable. And here I'm tempted to give you a short example. If we look at this famous last, for now, ordinance of the health minister, it says that one of the temporary measures is provision of personal protective equipment to the staff. But this should be done depending on the specifics of the working environment and the risk assessment of the workplace, which brings us to the nice question whether it is obligatory to wear masks in the office. And the answer here would be no. In general, this is not a mandatory thing that employees in an office space would have to do, but if the environment so requires, for example, there is no enough space or there is a prescription of the occupational health service, these could be also implemented in the offices. So thank you for letting me introduce the employment law perspective to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Vicky. So we can be relieved that it's not obligatory to wear masks in all offices. So that's a relief, at least for now, depending on the particular office environment. But for most offices, we can still go to work without masks, right?
Sure. I'll just give you an example which probably is not applicable to all our attendees, but imagine wearing obligatory gloves and working in a site where cutting inventory is used. So it is not worth including a finger in order to be protected from the virus. It's just a joke. Updated and suitable measures. That's the bottom line.
Thank you, Vicky. I'm sure that for most employers, now it is a very challenging time, and many of the employers are asking themselves what are the measures they need to take to ensure employee safety, compliance with government measures and business continuity. Are there any practices already on the market that they can learn from? Petko?
Hi, Daisy, thank you for the question. Although the virus affected us a few months ago, I could say there is already best practices to follow. And we have at Cushman & Wakefield developed the so-called 6 feet office concept, which is based on 6 simple rules that everyone shall follow. These are: be welcome at work, but always act responsibly, stick to the rules, and follow the signs that the landlord in the building or your employee has installed inside the premises. Stay safe at 6 feet distance away from each other, and walk always clockwise, and everywhere through the premises walk clockwise. Enter and leave the meeting rooms as it's been indicated by the employer, and always replace your desk pad and leave a clean desk behind you. Later in the webinar, we're going to show you how an office can be reorganized to a 6 feet concept. So thank you, Desi, and I'm going to give the word now to Vicky and Lena to DGKV to present the legal aspect of the question.
Thank you, Petko. Well, based on our experience and basically the experience that we had the opportunity to gather during the last couple of months, and of course, considering the legal environment and framework, I'm tempted to suggest a 4-step compliance plan, if we could put it this way, starting with an update of the health risk assessment, as this was recommended by the Labor Inspectorate. This is the step where the occupational health service would be actively involved. And then it is already appearing as a good practice to think of reorganization of the work process in order to be able to group employees in a way that if someone gets infected, the employer would not be expected to close the entire office, but would be able to limit the damages, so to put it. So reorganization could be thought in terms of place and in terms of time. When we think place, there are three options: working from the office, working from home, but it is also possible to think of a mixed working regime, combining both of them and switching place and office. And when we think of how to reorganize the time, we have already evidence that employers are introducing flexible working solutions, which are available and permissible under the Bulgarian Labor Code. Whatever the measures are and whatever the changes are, a very important stage would be the third step, implementation of the changes contemplated, and how to communicate them with the employees. So to start with the health measure, for example, it is good to note that employees, of course, must be informed so that they know that they should comply with their new obligations. But also for bigger companies having more than 5 employees, it is important to involve the so-called health committees in the discussion. And if there are changes to be implemented which concern a change in the place of work, for example, it is very important for employers to analyze the applicable procedures, because employees' consent may be required. In some other cases, it may appear that a simple modification of the internal rules would suffice. So this is the third stage, communication in implementation. And we go to the fourth step, where employers may consider specific measures, which we have seen being inspired by the COVID-19 situation. During the last months, we know that international groups have been seriously considering implementation of access control systems, monitoring the health status of employees, also considering obligatory medical examination and virus testing. And here it is quite important to keep in mind that regardless of the technology used, there is an important data privacy aspect which must be analyzed. And this brings me to our last participants, Elena, who I think would be glad to share the data privacy perspective on this point.
Thank you, Vicky, and hello, everyone. Indeed, some of the measures that we see implemented from our clients and also from the business in general involve the processing of personal health data. And personal health data is considered a special category of data, as we probably all know by now, and is subject to strict regulation under the GDPR rules. The big question in this regard is whether the employer at all is allowed to process that health data, and in what context, and how to do that lawfully and in compliance with GDPR. Unfortunately, there is no clear-cut answer, and there is no solution that would fit all in terms of processing health data. At European level, we've seen that the European Data Protection Board stated that in generally, processing of personal data for the purposes of prevention of the spread of COVID-19 is permissible under the grounds of GDPR. However, the board explicitly referred to the national legislation, which shall be the key in determining to what extent and how this compliance with GDPR shall be ensured. And on a national level, at this stage, like many other member states, actually, we only have a general obligation to ensure safety at work without any exact guidelines, also not provided by the Bulgarian Data Protection Authority, on how to implement those measures. The ordinance, which Vicky mentioned earlier, does allow, however, to consider temperature measurement as one of the measures to implement. But again, what we need to establish at every stage of implementation is that processing health data is really necessary and that it is proportionately done in respect of the goal that we are pursuing. So in this environment of legal uncertainty, we've seen mainly three groups of measures that are implemented by the business. It's temperature measurement, it's questionnaires on health status, and employee testing. And as there is no clear-cut solution, we would like to suggest a risk assessment model that would help you decide whether you can implement to process personal data at your facility with respect to your employees. And there are two main factors that shall be observed in this regard. Firstly, whether there is a state of epidemic declared officially on the state, on the territory of the state or the municipality where you're based. And secondly, whether instead of processing data, you could go for work from home or other measures that do not involve processing of personal health data. In this regard, if, for example, there is no epidemic officially declared, and if you can easily switch to home office work environment, it's going to be very hard for the employer to even justify temperature measurement at the premises as a preventative measure. On the opposite end, if there is an epidemic situation in the country or in the municipality, and because of various reasons and the nature of work, you can't reasonably send your employees home, then it may be more justifiable, more proportionate and necessary to somehow collect personal health data. But again, it should be assessed regularly, because what is allowed and permissible today may not be permissible tomorrow. So we advise our clients to always have a dedicated person that would track the legal environment and reassess the measures implemented. And in terms of all those three specific measures, we can come up with some general comments on how to ensure their compliance. Again, always conduct a data impact assessment. When you go for temperature measurement, then it's worth ensuring that you have accurate equipment to measure the temperature without large deviations of the data that is collected, and also not to store that information and not to write it down. Temperature measurement shall be permissible at the point of entry and without ongoing screening. In terms of questionnaires, it's important to reassess what questions have been asked to the employees and to third-party visitors, because countries that have been considered high risk, for example, 2 months ago, are not the same as those countries which pose risk now. And when we talk about employee testing, there our strictest advice is always to use a medical facility and a laboratory to conduct the tests, and also to reassess whether you indeed need to receive the test results of your employees. Because once a sick employee is detected, then the state system in place would prevent that employee from going to work. So it's really an open question here to address whether the employer needs to know the test results of the employees when the employer decides that testing is necessary and proportionate.
Thank you, Vicky and Lena. My next question is again to both of you. What should an employer do if an employee becomes sick of coronavirus?
Well, this is a funny situation, to be honest, because on one hand, we have the ordinance, the health minister ordinance, obliging the employers not to allow employees with acute manifestation of the disease in the office. On the other hand, evaluating the employee's health status based on external symptoms, and as a result, not letting him or her in the office premises, may result in unlawful suspension for work and some claims against the employer. So the best approach would be, with regard to sick employees, must be to encourage them to obtain a medical certificate and take a sick leave. Because from a legal perspective, it is the medical certificate would be the document to the legal method to limit access to the premises of a sick employee. And another interesting issue that has been rising recently is whether employers must report somehow infected or sick employees, either to state authorities or some private organizations? And the answer here is no. Employers, they don't have this obligation to report to state authorities or provide information on the employee's health status for any statistical purposes. Of course, there is this exception that for payroll purposes, employers need to report the sick leave certificates to the National Revenue Agency. But once again, what remains tricky here is how we deal with data and employees' data. Lena, can you elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah, sure. So as Vicky mentioned, indeed, it's interesting what are the obligations and whether it is allowed to somehow inform the other employees or state authorities on the status of an already sick employee from the coronavirus. And as she said, also from GDPR perspective, is not permissible to report that employee to the state authorities. And as regards the other employees, again, the recommendation of the European Data Board is that personal data regarding sick employees shall not be disclosed, and that information should be only communicated on an anonymized basis to the other employees, with minor exceptions where it is strictly necessary to inform the immediate, for example, co-workers that have spent a lot of time together in one closed room with the sick employee, and advise that employee that co-worker to also undergo testing because he or she might be infected. And in any case, it is very and highly recommendable that whenever you disclose whatever information on sick employees, you ensure that there is no retaliation, that there is no basis for discrimination of the sick employee, because that can trick you in other legal issues and problems later on. And that's very important here to do that properly when you have a sick employee at your office.
Thank you so much, Lena. Now I would like to bring our real estate experts back into the discussion with our next topic. What will the future look like for the office workplace? Stanimiro, it's already evident that working from home is a big factor. We saw that 2/3 of our participants today joined from their home office. What would be your comments on that? Is this a long-term trend?
We try to understand what is actually the current situation with our clients, with the tenants in the office buildings. And as you can see on our slide, actually, the results of the question asked earlier today is absolutely covered by the answers we managed to receive from companies that do have approximately above 22,000 employees. We had discussions with them on the questions, what is their current status, what they're doing with the office, are they aware, what will they do, what are their plans? And there are very interesting findings which I would like to share, but in general, I can mention that it looks like the offices do have a very positive future. It could be different, but positive. As you can see from the charts, actually, around 40% of the companies do started the process of returning the employees back and in the offices from mid of May. So 28% of the employees were invited to come back to the offices. The other good result from our discussions with the tenants is that in the coming 3 months, it means June, July, and August, 55% will start going back to the office. And actually, the minority of the companies still think not to go back to the offices, and they postpone this decision, at least for now, towards the end of the year. What is interesting to know is that not all the employees will go back to the offices. In most of the cases, the companies will use 50-50% ratio, which means 50% of the employees will stay at home for 1 week or 2 weeks, and then they will come back to the office again for 1 or 2 weeks. The other companies selected to go for 3 groups of employees and to have at one and the same time around 30% of their workers at the office. And many of them do implement a different starting time and ending time, not to make a crowd at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, which means that even having only 50% of the employees in the offices, they would start at 8:30 and then at 9 and then at 9:30, respectively, ending the working hours in the same with the same time difference. Majority of companies actually have undertaken measures in order to reorganize their offices, which does not mean that they have changed their offices, but for sure they have implemented such measures as providing of sanitizing materials in the office. They have made the organization of the desks in a way that there is a social distance between the employees. They've limited the usage of common areas such as kitchenettes, entertainment areas, meeting rooms in the offices. And the weighted answer is that almost 70% of the employees will return to the offices, which will look a little bit different, with labels, with some new internal rooms, and prescriptions on what and how they should do and follow as a way of working and organizing their working space. Again, if we look at the general pool of the answers, we can say that taking into consideration the people that have already went back to the offices and the ones that intend to go back in the coming 3 months, in an average, 40% of the employees will be simultaneously in the offices. Again, in different companies and different sectors, this percentage is different, but in average, only 40% of the employees will be back to the offices at one and the same time. Of course, one big question is what actually the companies will do with their office premises. Here we have quite a clear picture. However, this picture is as of this moment, I would like to underline. For now, majority of the companies has stated that they do not look for space optimization in the sense of decreasing the office space. And only 1% of the companies stated clearly that they will give back a portion of their office space because they do not consider it as necessary. Around 40% of the companies still don't know what will they do, and in most of the cases these are international companies and they expect some global decisions that still are not taken, and it will be difficult to be taken because in different countries the situation is different. However, we will monitor further this situation in order to see what changes will come in the coming months. And one more note to this is that we've tried to discuss the situation with companies that reflect the general structure of our market, dominated by IT and BPO companies, but of course, these answers covered companies like banks, insurance companies, pharma companies, consulting companies. So we do have actually covered all the sectors, and we are presenting here weighted answers.
Thank you very much, Stanimira. Your research definitely shows that nothing will be the same. My next question is also to you. With so many companies considering going back to the office in the next 3 months, with so many changes that Lena and Vicky highlighted earlier, like body temperature scanning, masks and sanitizing measures, what do you expect to be the new normal when we enter the office buildings in the next weeks for full-time work or for business meetings? And before I give you the floor, I would like to invite you to be a little bit shorter, all of you, because I'm cautious with time and we have a lot more questions to cover. So Stanimira, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so now I'll draw your attention to what has already been done by the landlords. So when your employees will come back to the office buildings, they for sure will see some changes. Again, we've spoken with a big part of the office investors in Sofia, and these are the results from our discussions. All of the landlords and all the projects and all the buildings, they do have undertaken already measures for securing possibility and need of disinfection in the strategic points of the buildings. So every employee will see that at the entrance, there are dispensers, and this they will see next to the office door and toilets and in other common areas. A big portion of the landlords already implemented thermal cameras at the entrances, and this is around 20% of the buildings and of the office space that we've approached. Almost the same percentage has implemented specific traffic flow in the buildings. Of course, here we should have in mind that not all the buildings allow a change of this organization. And a certain percentage of the buildings has undertaken a change in their ventilation and cooling and heating systems. But here I would like to mention that the biggest part of the buildings and projects, when we're talking about office buildings, do use only fresh air, and all the used air is actually exhausted from the premises and not brought back into the areas where employees are sitting. As a general note, to draw your attention that only 6.3% of the projects registered a vacancy rate increase due to COVID. And as mentioned earlier, this is a result of existing break options in the contracts. And around 40% of the market accepted a temporary rent reduction for the period of state of emergency or other incentives to the tenants. With this, I would like to give the word to Lena for the legal news around coming back to the office.
Thank you, Stanimira. To be brief, I just want to highlight one important aspect. You mentioned that 20% of the landlords have already implemented thermal cameras at the entries of the office buildings. And in that regard, it's very important for the tenants in those buildings who are employers to regulate this and other measures that involve processing of personal data, to regulate who is a data controller and who is a data processor in a specific agreement between them, and also to predetermine when there is an employee with an increased temperature, body temperature, who shall be informed of that decision and how this information is communicated and written down, because all of this has risks related to compliance with GDPR. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. Now let's try to put ourselves in the shoes of the commercial real estate investors. Kaluyan, will there be new rules for use of common areas in buildings and office complexes? And as landlords, what are their responsibilities for the facility management operations?
Thank you, Desi. Well, as we see, there are many measures which are required, many plans being made, and everything this is related, of course, to investments and also operational expenses. So I will just mention two key points here as regard to responsibility of the landlords and owners of the buildings. First is that they have the responsibility to maintain the whole building as a business, and the responsibility to ensure that they have sufficient working capital and financial resources to cover first requirements which they have to carry on as and meet as owners of the building, and then to address the needs of the tenants. And this brings us to the second key point, is that from facility management perspective, the base case scenario is the following. The landlord provides the services and the tenants pay through the service charge or other different mechanisms. So with regard to common areas and all the changes and health and safety measures which will have to be done, access control, temperature checks, and etc., this could be done through the services and service charge mechanisms, and that's why both parties have to look carefully what the lease agreement says about the services which the landlord has to provide, and respectively how the costs for these services are covered by the tenants. Because we see, and I will just mention it, we see different options. Like in the past few years, many buildings agreed to a fixed service charge rate, which is indexed annually. Others are working on open book policy, which might be more suitable in this case, but it has to be again checked what is the balance of incoming monthly payments and what will be the reconciliation in the end of the year. So this is an important topic to ensure that there's sufficient cash flow to meet all these needs. Yeah, another thing which I'll mention as a final point is that there are some buildings where different owners own premises on different floors, and this brings in the local law rules related to condominium and then costs and decisions related to common areas, maintenance and repairs, reconstructions have to be done by the general meeting of the owners. So this adds another level of complexity and planning of how to deal with these circumstances. So back to you, Desi.
Thank you, Kalyan. Stanimira, back to you. Do you have some short comments about the costs for for landlords and also for the service charges?
Of course, it is visible and quite understandable that the expenses of the landlords will increase and has already increased. And there are for sure three main points where these costs are rising. It's first of all, maintenance of HVAC system, which will be done much more carefully and with higher frequency. Regular cleaning of the common areas, which again will be increased and enlarged with sanitizing of all the common areas on a regular basis daily, and additional measures which are needed for control and security in terms of allowing people to come into the office buildings. That's why we're sure that these additional expenses will be done by the landlords, and of course they will be somehow reflected in most of the cases in the service charge. But we should also do not forget that employers will face increase of expenses as well, as the biggest part of the obligation for securing and providing healthy working space is actually their obligation. So all the measures and expenses connected with these measures has to be taken into consideration, and they of course will vary depending on the office, on the building, etc. But both of the parties, the tenants and the landlords, will face such additional costs.
Thank you, Stanimira. Many of us have gotten used to working in open space environment. Kalyan, what are the global trends? The global trends, is it already a thing in the past?
Yeah, I will just briefly mention something because design is not really a legal point, and I will let later on Petko to elaborate on it, but it is very interesting the following. What we hear from clients and also colleagues in Bulgaria and other jurisdictions is that the focus, and also on this webinar today, is that the focus is employers want to make sure that the employees feel safe when they're back in the office. And linked to this, I read an interesting article in CNBC, I think was the website, about the following, that are we going to see the high-walled cubicles, which were very famous in the 90s when we come back to the office. So this is one design idea from the past which can be introduced to the future. And another thing which was again mentioned, and I will probably stop there from the design perspective, is that we will be looking at a larger hallways and other ways the common areas will be structured that will provide a bigger distance between the people walking around. So in this, from legal at least part is that what we may see in the future is that buildings which are in the pipeline and have the ability and finances to reorganize their layouts may be more competitive, attracting tenants leaving older buildings, for example. So this will be interesting to see, but I will give the floor to Petko to explain better what designs we will see and what will be more efficient.
Thank you, Kauyan. This straight answer to your question is the open space office a thing of the past. We may say that it's not, but we shall follow the rules in the reorganized offices. We're showing at the moment on the screen standard office having its reception area, waiting zone, 3 meeting rooms, small kitchen, few phone booths, and an open space for about 40 people. So following the rules that I mentioned earlier, we have introduced the one-way traffic system, which, can you please go to the next slide, which you can see on the slide. And we have marked the seats that should not be taken from the employees in order to keep the 6 feet distance away from each other. We have even numbered in the meeting room, the chairs in the meeting rooms in the kitchen. So everyone entering the room knows which chair to take depending whether they go first, second, or third in the respective room. We have reorganized the open space to allow the clockwise movement. So you can see on the left side of the offices. By doing this, we challenged we face that the people sitting opposite to each other do not comply to the rule for 6 feet distance away from each other. That's why we introduced a protection screen between the workstations. Can you please go to the next slide? So on the first picture, you see a standard workstation for 2 people. On the second picture, you see a protection screen, which is the standard solution with a plexiglass, which is fully transparent, and you almost do not see it. It actually can bring you a little bit back to the cubicles that Kauyan mentioned, but you're still in the open space. You still can communicate directly with your colleagues. Unfortunately, we face the challenge that 80% of the plexiglass, which is the standard solution, is supplied in Bulgaria from Spain. And as we know, Spain's economy still hasn't restarted. So the suppliers give a delivery term for between 13 and 15 weeks. So this may lead to a delay in reorganizing the open space. So we found the custom solutions with aluminum frames and thin, again, transparent vinyls, which you can even reuse after all the situation with COVID-19 disappears. So these are just a few samples, but let's now see the video how our Cushman & Wakefield office in Netherlands has been reorganized.
We started the 6 Feet Office project with the ambition to get the world safer and sooner back at work. We believe that a safe and healthy workplace is at the center of what's next. We have developed the 6 Feet Office as part of our total workplace concept. Cushman & Wakefield can get companies operational as soon and cost efficient as possible. We would like to inspire organizations and people about a safe and healthy workplace, finding a better work-life balance, and becoming more engaged with the ambitions of your organization. Also like to invite companies to join us develop the 6 Feet Office project further from a technology perspective, facilities, or just good ideas to make work better. Thank you for helping us move this forward. Together we're stronger.
Thank you, Petko. This video was very helpful to help us visualize how the office of the future will look like. And the future is probably tomorrow. Now I would like to go back to another topic that is for all the employers who are still hesitating whether to continue working from home or to introduce some sort of mix. My next question is to Stanimira. What should we expect in the commercial real estate sector? Will our homes become a significant part of the business operations?
Thank you, Desi. Sure, many questions are currently under discussion how to go further with our organizations and how to work. What is clear now is that everybody has reconfirmed the possibility to work not only from office. And if we can go actually to the slide. So this is one very interesting conclusion that was not clear and not evident a couple of months ago. Actually, what we are discussing now, whether we will go back to the office, not back to the work, because we do work from everywhere. Most of the employers currently really considering the flexibility and are ready to give a choice to the employees whether to work from the office or from their homes. However, these are the conclusions and these are ideas which are based on a very short time, on a very short period of time. And it is still not clear whether and how this situation will affect the long-term relations between the employee and the company, how it will affect the productivity of the people. So that's why our general idea is that the office will not disappear and the standard, let's say, the known office isn't going anywhere. We believe that still the talent and the people will be in the center of the decisions, and that's why the employers will be ready to offer really a flexibility to the employees, which includes the variety of locations where these employees can work from and are allowed to work from. That's why we see that the future of the office will be actually a total workplace ecosystem consisting of a standard office, consisting of the home office organization, as well as other flexible office solutions. This is what we expect to happen, and of course we are monitoring the market and the tenants and the landlords in order to confirm these expectations.
Thank you, Stani. Vicky, Lena, what is the legal aspect of this? Does the employer enter in our homes as employees, and what are the challenges and obligations to both the employer and the employee?
First, let me start with a clarification because we have received this question earlier. What is commonly known as home office or working from home is actually legally defined as working from distance, which means working remotely by using technology from any place outside the office premises of the employer. This means that we could either opt for our homes or other places from the side of the employees. Whichever place we choose, however, there is a very well developed legal framework and the rights and obligations arising for both employer and employee. Nevertheless, we see that in practice, employers face numerous issues when introducing homework. As we are running out of time, I would just suggest going through my top 3. How to introduce a distance from work regime in a lawful manner in compliance with all the legal requirements, how to ensure health and safety outside the office premises, which is really a very common question, especially recently, and how to address potential work accidents in the context of home office. So starting with the first point, how to introduce the distance work regime, it should be, I'd like to make it very clear that the situation during the epidemic period is different from a legal perspective from what is the normal framework. So temporary during the emergency period, which is expected to end by the 14th of June, it was possible, it has been possible that an employer introduces homework by simply issuing an order and notifying the employees of it. And by the end of the emergency period, the legal ground for this order would drop off, and respectively employees would be required to come back to the office. But following the 14th of June, when we expect the end of the epidemic period, distance work terms will need to be agreed by both parties, which means that employers will have to seek employees' consent in order to introduce homework. And what is more, all terms and conditions will need to be covered in the individual employment agreements by amending them. I will just quickly mention some of the major points that an employer should think of when approaching the employees with potential amendments. So reporting requirements during home office, necessary equipment, how to maintain it, who is responsible for the related costs, and of course, the prevention of fraud of data breach. This is something that law requires. And if we continue with the topic of how to ensure health and safety outside the office, I'm tempted to quote here what the law says, and it is that home workers must benefit from the same rights in terms of health and safety as office workers. What is more, employers are responsible for ensuring minimum standards, and not doing so is a breach of law. And again, we go further, employees are entitled to complain if they are not provided with these minimum standards. So this is what the law requires, but it doesn't say how to implement and how to ensure these measures. Of course, starting with the provision of clear instructions, this is the easy part, but employers are also facing this challenge that they will need to find a way to actually inspect the working environment of the home workers. And this brings us to the famous questions whether physical visits could be organized. From a legal perspective, this is permissible, this is feasible, and the labor code allows employer representatives to visit our homes, our home offices to expect. Moreover, employees should agree to this. So refusing by the argument that this is my home and I'm not letting externals would not be valid. And it is interesting to know that in April this month, there has been an official request to the Ministry of Labor whether there will be some exceptions in terms of health and safety during home office, and the Ministry of Labor confirmed that there will be no exceptions. So theoretically, even during the epidemic, employers were expected to visit the home workers and were allowed to check what the situation is. Which brings us to the next question of potential work accidents and how to address them. Unfortunately, the answer here is that, at least from a legal perspective, the general rules will apply, and there are no legislative limitations which would apply to employers in case of introduction of home work and home office. We have questions in this regard, so I guess that we'll be able to elaborate further. But now just let me mention there is also another tricky part for home workers, and it is how to ensure data integrity, because this is also an issue. And I would invite Lena to join me here for this answer.
Thank you, Vicky. So indeed, when our offices move to our home, so does the obligation of the employer, but also of the employee, to protect company data, including personal data and all other trade secrets and etc. And in this regard, again, we have a general legal obligation under GDPR, but also under the our own legal acts to ensure data security without clear instructions how to do that. So recommendable here is to consult with your IT management people and professionals, and also document that process, because GDPR requires and imposes accountability principle. And in this regard, it is also necessary to think about giving instructions, clear instructions to your employees. Can they store documents at home? What documents can be brought home? What should remain at the office? To implement download controls of folders that can be saved or cannot be saved outside the company server. Also think about checking your VPN security and all other sets of measures on technical and organizational levels as to how to ensure data security. Because unlike the UK Data Protection Authority, which allows for some leniency during the epidemic and has issued explicit guidance in this respect, at a local level, there are no exceptions as to the standard obligations and the standard of due care by employers and by data controllers as to how to protect data.
Thank you, Lena. We were worried when we discussed with our panelists that the topic is quite broad and we might be running out of time. I'm very grateful to all our attendees for bearing with us. Thank you so much for dedicating your time for listening to us today. Before moving to the Q&A section, I would like to share with you my main takeaway from today's webinar. Actually, it turns out that there is so much change going on, and all employers and managers are facing so many questions. It seems that the future is bright. We will manage to work out the situation. However, we should really trust the expertise of the experts, both legally and in terms of facility management and real estate. Definitely we should consult with the experts, because there is so much news going on and so much new trends to be following. But definitely it's good that we have the experts on board so we can trust in them. We had close to 20 questions asked by the registered participants prior to the webinar. Many of them were dealt with during the presentations of the participants. A few more questions you will be seeing on the screen, and If you don't mind, if our panelists still have some time, we can still take a few of the questions that we received in the Q&A session. If we don't have enough time, don't worry, your questions will be responded to personally following the webinar. So the first questions are going back to our lawyers. Vicky, you will be taking the first ones.
Thank you, Desi. Once again, these questions regarding physical visits, and are employers actually required to send teams tasked with estimating health and safety? Now, to put it this way, a physical visit is allowed in the employee's home office, and it is to employers' interest to do so, because this is a manner to allow the employer to actually inspect what is on place, assess the health risk assessment, and also exercise further control. Of course, to be honest, I don't think that this is a very common practice, but it is allowed, and in the end, it is the employer bearing the responsibility for health and safety. So the employer has the interest to do its best to check what is the situation. Probably
next question. Yeah.
Okay. So these questions regard the transition back to the office, and it is a good one. From a legal perspective, distance work is voluntary. This is what the labor code says, and employees' refusal in general to transfer from office to home office in distance work must not have any negative consequences for the employee. So once again, we cannot enforce employees to go back home and work after the end of the epidemic situation. So there are two options: keeping the distance work after the 14th of June will require both parties' consent and modifying the individual employment contracts in general. And employees' refusal could not be sanctioned. And there is also the opposite question. An employee's refusal to return to the office will, in general, be considered a breach of labor discipline, and the employee could be sanctioned if, of course, distance work has been introduced for the fixed period of the epidemic period. Okay.
Next question.
Are there any specific challenges regarding the employment of new team members? So from a legal perspective, there's nothing special in this regard. General rules will apply, but yes, we know that in practice, recruitment and onboarding process, if they are conducted on site, we will need to comply with the health and safety measures which are put in place. And of course, if execution and exchange of documentation is to be tackled here, we come to another big issue, whether this could be done electronically, or we should stick to the old-fashioned ways of using postal services. Both ways are possible. Okay, next slide. No, okay, so this is one of my favorite questions, and I'm very happy when clients address it to us. Whether finally there will be a law that allows digital signing of documents. And I have a good news here, that is that there is a perfectly working and applicable legal framework which allows digital signing of documents. Legal framework is existing on EU level since 2018, and on national level we have electronic signature. We have a local act which allows electronic signing, but since 2018 there is a specific ordinance which regulates the requirements which are applicable for keeping electronic files of the employees. Of course, there are a number of technical requirements which must be implemented. And I guess this is one of the, probably this is one of the reasons why companies are still reluctant. But there is, as I said, good news. Court practice is developing and this is becoming more and more common. So just take some time to check these technical requirements. It may appear that it is cost effective to implement them rather to use the old-fashioned ways. Okay, is there another? Well, I think that this is no longer an employment-related question.
Yeah, it's actually to me. I will take this question. Unfortunately, the question is what is the best solution for ventilation system work in the new conditions? Unfortunately, there isn't a straight answer to this question, but what we may say is that ventilation system working with 100% fresh air, which has been pre-cooled or preheated to provide the comfort inside the premises, is a solution that is not going to spread the virus within the premises. Of course, preventive maintenance, cleaning and disinfection are the necessary measures that shall be taken in order to keep the ventilation system working safe and in a way that is being designed to. So the next question, please. Are the shared air conditioning systems and respectively there at the building dangerous and potentially can be contagious? This somehow is related to the previous question, and no, they're not dangerous. The shared systems, when they work with 100% fresh air, are not dangerous. It's important to say that even system which has a certain percentage of circulation, if the air is purified and it passes through the relevant filters that could avoid spreading of the virus, these systems are also not dangerous and they could continue being used.
Stanimir, I think this one is for you.
Yes, there was a question registered before this webinar about the flexible office options. And there is another one I have seen in the question and answer section about the flexible office solutions as an alternative for the employers to send the employees to this kind of premises. What we can say for sure is that the concept of flexible office solutions will survive, even some of the operators currently do face a lot of problems. And the concept, I would like to once again remind that the flexible office options, they do provide flexibility both in terms of size and in terms of term of the lease relations and lease contracts. This flexibility is extremely important nowadays, and having in mind the generally expected change of the office into an office ecosystem, for sure this concept will have a place on the market and will survive and will gain on importance. We should understand that maybe we will see some changes in this direction as well. Maybe some of the landlords will have to provide this kind of services as well. Maybe some of big and significant tenants will have to sublease their premises, and in order to do so, they have to provide this kind of services. So that's why for sure flexible office solutions and co-working solutions will have the importance and will be again something to be discussed in the coming month actively.
Thank you, Stanimira. This is the last question that we received prior to the webinar. I would ask all our panelists to have a quick look through the Q&A session with the questions that some of our participants asked during the webinar. If you could pick up a few questions with short answers. And again, we'll make sure that the others are responded to after the webinar. Can you have a quick look and let me know who would like to pick up a question?
Desi, I can say a word on the one question from Nelly Vacheva. Is the landlord obliged to do some upgrades, reconstruction of the central climate? Again, from legal perspective, there are 2 points of view. The first one is if the HVAC system is technically compliant with the current regulation and is maintained according to the technical specifications of the supplier, there is a very strong argument to say that they don't have to do any upgrades or reconstructions of the central climate for the existing tenants. The second point of view, however, is what does the lease agreement say? Does the landlord have the obligation continuously throughout the lease term to ensure that some systems, for example, HVAC, is constantly upgraded to the best standards at the time? Or, for example, if there are some recordings and measures from the health and safety perspective of a particular office space and there are some deviations due to design or others, then in that case, the lender may have an obligation to do something about it. So from this second point of view, the key is to look carefully what does the contract say with regard to such kind of obligations, which is not only related to HVAC, actually. So this is my legal point of view on this question.
And just to add a sentence to this question, as a part of preparation of the office premises in order employees to come back to the office, is actually our project management team can make overview of the existing systems in the building and in the specific office and recommend and advise whether these systems are in compliance with the regulations, whether they need to do an upgrade and what kind of upgrades potentially are needed in order to secure the health and safety regulations and of course to prepare the office to the new normal situation of the COVID.
Thank you, Stanimira. Anyone else who would like to pick up a quick response to some of the questions in the Q&A session, or should we leave them for after the webinar? Probably that's a good time to close because we are already 15 minutes beyond the initially announced duration. Thank you very much again to our 5 panelists for making this happen, and it was very obvious that you had prepared very thoroughly for today's webinar. Thank you again for all the participants. We will follow up with a link to the recording of the webinar so you can refer to it at a later stage. I hope our panelists will allow us also to share the slides so you can refer to them later as well. Thank you again, and wishing you a nice afternoon and sunny weekend, although that's probably not going to happen, but let's at least wish for it. Goodbye and see you soon, hopefully live. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.